Well, good afternoon. My name is Denise Vega. I am an author and a former Colorado Book Award winner. So I'm super honored to be here today. These readings and the awards themselves are some of my favorite events. So I was already signed up to come and listen, and then they asked if I would do this, and I was so happy and honored to say yes. I would like to thank the Buggies on behalf of all of us, the Colorado Humanities, and all of us who are readers. And of course, for hosting the Juvenile Literature and Young Adult Lit Colorado Book Finalists this afternoon. Like the Colorado Humanities, and I think all of us, we love to talk about what we read. And any of you who have a question for the authors after they've read, feel free to do that. I know I always have questions, so I hope some of you do as well. So today, I'm happy to introduce two talented authors, one in juvenile and one in young adult lit. So our first author is Nancy Oswald, and she is a finalist in the juvenile literature category. She will read from her book, Bats, Bandits, and Buggies, a Ruby and Maude Adventure. So happy Ruby and Maude are still continuing their adventures, Nancy. Besides writing historical fiction books for young readers, Nancy has also written personal interest pieces, children's plays, poetry, educational research, biography, and nonfiction articles. Her books have won the Spur Award, the SEPA Evie Award, Willa Literary Award, Will Rogers Award, Colorado Authors League Writing Award, and have had multiple finalist recognitions. Nancy currently lives on a family ranch near Cotopaxi. All right, Nancy.
Well, thank you, Denise. Thank you, Julie, and the Bookies and the Book Bar as well. They're tied together, and it's great to be here. And thank you there's an extra chair there if you want to sit, because there's, I won't be sitting there. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about the Ruby and Maude Adventure. So this is technically the fourth. The first three were all set in Cripple Creek. And so I write mostly Colorado set historical fiction for young readers, young at heart. But Ruby has, in this book, Ruby's moved on from her life in Cripple Creek, and she's 2 years older, and she also is in Colorado Springs now. So those are familiar to Colorado people, those settings. So for this book, it was kind of fun because it was I was kind of ready to move on from Cripple Creek. I'd done all the research there, and so having her be 2 years older was a help. And but it was all new research, all new historical facts and those kinds of things that I had to look at, which actually was kind of fun, because one of the reasons I like writing historical fiction is because I really like learning about the places in Colorado where the books are set. So one of the things I had to research for this book was like the trolley system, because in 1898 in Colorado Springs, the trolleys were a big part of it. So I had a lot of fun with that. Went to the Trolley Museum, if you've never been there, in Colorado Springs, and then also ended up, somehow I get hung up on little details, like were there lights in the trolley, for a certain scene. So I really can get nitpicky on some of those little details, and which don't mean that much to the reader, but to me they matter, because if there's, you want to know, was it dark in there or not, But the other thing was, for this book, was looking at Colorado Springs in 1898 and how was the city laid out, how, what, if you had a donkey, and now Ruby, in this book, Ruby has two donkeys, she still has her cat named Trouble, then where would you house the donkey? So, because they're now in a more of a city. In Cripple Creek, they kind of lived on the edge of town, and they managed the donkeys a couple of different ways. But anyway, so things like that, like where was the open space, and making sure that the donkeys had a pasture, and a few things like that. So it was fun research, and fun to have Ruby in a new setting. And I'll read from the first chapter, and you will find out a little bit about the trolley already because Ruby is not really adapting very well to being in the city. If you read any of the other Ruby and Maude adventures, you would know that it's like she's not a city girl. And so one more thing about Ruby is she was never in a town until she was in Cripple Creek, because she was out there on the trail. So she's just got that outdoor girlsy thing going. So, okay, chapter 1. Ruby pressed the toe of her boot onto the trolley track, estimating the arrival time. 6 minutes, she figured, from the rumble beneath her toe. She flicked her braid off the damp collar of her dress and daydreamed about hiking with Pa and her donkey Maude over a high mountain pass with hawks swirling above and a cool breeze tickling her neck. The mountains were never boring. Pa taught Ruby the names of wildflowers and pointed out animal tracks and little burrows where the animals live. If they were lucky, he pointed out the animals too. Ruby had seen mountain lions, marmots, bears, birds of all kinds, crawly things, and even a rattlesnake or two. Pa did all her schooling. Ruby could out-multiply, out-read, and out-geography everyone in her class. She loved learning until she'd been snagged by the school principal in Cripple Creek and imprisoned by a hard wooden desk surrounded by colorless walls. At least when they lived in Cripple Creek, their cabin was at the edge of town, but here they lived in a small white house on North Weber Street, crowded with neighbors. Ruby gazed up at the high, wispy clouds, cirrus, the fair weather clouds. She knew all the clouds, cumulus, the one she called the storytelling clouds, and nimbostratus, dark and moody. Lately, Ruby had been a nimbostratus. After Pa married Bertie, he painted their new living situation with a flowery brush. You're going to like living in Colorado Springs. She didn't. You'll meet lots of nice girls in school. They were just as snooty as the girls in Cripple Creek. We'll find a pasture for Maude and Willie. Ruby wanted to keep Maude and her 2-year-old foal in the backyard. She couldn't. You'll have a room of your own, and Trouble, who's the cat, can stay in the house with us. Thank goodness Pa wasn't going to send her cat out to the pasture with the donkeys. Ruby couldn't pinpoint the unsettled feeling whirling like dust devils and disappearing just as quickly. Town life in Cripple Creek was bad enough, but after one whole year in Colorado Springs, she realized things could always get worse. Bertie said it was normal for a 13-year-old to have ups and downs. Pa said, "Stop shilly-shallying and find something to do this summer." Ruby thought taking care of Maude and Willie was plenty of something to do, but when Pa mentioned the police had brought an abandoned buggy to the livery where he worked, she settled on a plan. She would train her donkey Maude to drive, and before long they'd be carrying people around town, maybe millionaires or tourists or famous hurly-burly girls. She imagined the money she'd earn and how she'd spend it. Pa said the buggy was selling for a good price, and Ruby was on her way downtown to meet him. At least she wouldn't be bored if her plan worked out. A loud clang jarred Ruby from her thoughts. The trolley wheels squealed to a stop, and she climbed the 2 steps and dropped a nickel into the collection box. 2 strangers, a man and a woman, sat in her favorite seat just behind the motorman's platform. She tripped over the woman's large open-topped satchel. When Ruby reached down to stand it back up, a piece of black clothing spilled out. "Don't touch that," the man grumbled. "Watch your step," the woman snapped. Ruby hurried through the combination coach. The back compartment had 3 open-air wooden benches spanning the width of the car. She dropped down to the front bench, adding that noise and rude people to the list of things she disliked about living in the city. Ruby adjusted her haversack. It had belonged to Bertie's first husband, who died in a hunting accident. It was the only handbag Ruby would carry after Bertie suggested she need something to keep her belongings from escaping. Mostly school belongings like her composition book and 6th grade reader. She'd finished her reader in a couple weeks, then lost it on purpose so she wouldn't have to read out loud to the teacher. It was embarrassing and boring. The girls at school made fun of the haversack, but it turned out to be handy for collecting rocks and the skeletons of small mammals she found in the pasture when she visited the donkeys. The pockets in her dresses were barely big enough for a handkerchief. She listened to the metal wheels bumping along the track and returned to thoughts about her business. Giving buggy rides around town would be an adventure. Ruby hoped. Besides solving the boredom problem, she wanted two other things this summer: an adventure and a new book to read. The free libraries only had dull books for old people, nothing exciting. Ruby didn't think a new book was too much to ask for. She'd read Pa's Sherlock Holmes detective stories so many times she knew the next words without even turning the page. With the money earned from her new business, Ruby would be able to buy a new book for herself, maybe even 2 or 3. The brakes of the streetcar screeched to a stop, and more passengers boarded from the open sides of the car. Ruby moved to the end of the bench so she could breathe fresh air and not get crushed between the hot, sweaty passengers. A crowded trolley on a June day made Ruby feel like a fish in a fry pan. The last leg of the downtown trip took the longest. People jostled on and off the trolley as the trolley inched through the pedestrians and mixed with horse-drawn carriages. As the taller buildings came into view, Ruby had an eerie feeling she was being watched. She felt a tug on her braid. She tensed, resisting the urge to turn around. Another tug, and she glimpsed a vanishing hand. After a third yank, she spun around as a boy wearing an Irish flat cap slid down on the bench behind her and pulled the worn cap over his face. Ruby glared at him. She flipped her braid forward and turned, staring straight ahead. Tug, tug, yank. Ruby predicted the next attack. She swung around, clenching her fist, ready to wallop the troublemaker. The boy removed his cap, and a crop of red hair sprang out. Freckles dotted the boy's nose above his wide smile. "Hi, Ruby." Ruby blinked, ignoring the heavy-set woman next to her who squirmed to reclaim more space. "Roy? It's me. Roy O'Rourke?" she repeated. She could have said, "Stop pulling my braid," or "What are you doing here?" Instead, she spluttered, "You're bigger." "I've been eating bears," Roy smiled, twisted. So that's probably about 5 minutes, so I'm not timing with somebody else. So
You're good. Yeah,
I'm good.
If you wanted to continue, if you wanted to.
I'll go a little bit farther, and then somebody can give me the high sign,
Yes,
the
I
hook
can
or the hook or the something. But anyway, okay. So I've been eating bears. Roy's smile twisted. Ruby remembered Roy's crooked smile. It always made her wonder if he was lying or telling the truth. She humphed again and faced forward, folding her arms across her haversack. At the next stop, Roy wiggled out to the running board and climbed around the bench, squeezing in next to Ruby and causing the overweight woman to stand and wobble to the front of the trolley. The large woman sat in the seat where the rude man and woman had been before. Good riddance to all of them, Ruby thought. She studied Roy eyeball to eyeball. He used to be the shortest, scrawniest boy in her class. Now he'd caught up and had flesh on his bones, except for his hands. His skin was scraped and scabbed over as if he'd tangled with the meat grinder. Ruby's gaze dropped to Roy's lap. He held a yellow-covered book, the title hidden from view. "Is that a new book?" "Nope, I would not be caught dead reading." She reached for the book, but he pulled it away, not letting her see the title. His eyes danced with mischief. "I don't want anybody to know about my bad habit. It's like my drinking habit. I can't quit." She wrinkled her brow. "You haven't started drinking, have you?" He snorted. "I don't remember you being so gullible. I don't remember you knowing words like gullible." Ruby leaned closer, itching to see the title. She hoped it wasn't the one she'd read. Hoped it wasn't one she had read. "Can I see it?" She grabbed at the book, but Roy pulled it away. She managed to catch sight of 2 red embossed letters, capital D and a capital A. The middle of the word was under his fingers. "I'm returning the book to my aunt. She let me read it, but said if one page was bent, smudged, or damaged, she'd skin me alive." This irked Ruby. She'd loaned Roy plenty of books when she was teaching him to read. He wasn't so careful then. They'd been returned in much worse for the wear. She pressed in, wishing that he would show her the rest of the cover. Roy didn't budge. He kept the spine turned away from her and flopped the book face down on his lap. For a moment, she gave up trying. "Are you here visiting your aunt?" "Sorta." Ruby recalled how infuriating Roy could be. How can you be sort of visiting your aunt? I ran away, he said. She gaped at him in disbelief. Pa made me quit school and start mucking at the mine. This took Ruby a minute to digest. Roy was older than she was, but not by much. You missed a year of school? She could only think of one thing more awful than school, and that was working in the mines. At least she taught him to read before he was sentenced to life underground. If my pa had his way, I'd never be able to go to school again. I'd be doomed to a life of misery. I decided to run away. She felt a twinge of guilt about tossing her reader. Shoveling all day in the dark had to be much worse than school. I'd hike over the mountains again if I had to, he said. If Aunt Agnes hadn't let me stay, I might be able. Hadn't let me stay, I might be able to go. Lets me stay, I might be able to go to school here. It would be a lot better than working in a mine. Her eyes widened. You hiked here from Cripple Creek? He shrugged. I figured if Jake Hawker could escape and climb up the mountains with a gunshot wound, it wouldn't be too hard for me to hike back to where we found him and down this side. Ruby wanted to remind Roy about saving his life, but didn't want to argue with him. After all, she hadn't seen Roy in over a year, and he was holding a new book. She glowered. Roy should show it to her. He continued his story. I would have been here sooner, except for the bear. Ruby eyed Roy doubtfully. What bear? Up on the mountain, he said, as if there was no other place to encounter a bear. He rolled up his sleeve and showed her the scratches on his right arm. This was from climbing the tree. I've more scrapes on my legs where the bear raked me with its claws. Ruby struggled to merge her memory of the Roy she hadn't seen in over a year with the Roy sitting beside her. His arms used to be skinny as chicken bones. Now they had some muscle. She blushed, thinking about a recent talk she'd had with Pa and Bertie about growing up. To hide her embarrassment, she said, I suppose you're going to tell me it was the same bear you ate. Roy shook his head. I barely escaped with my life. I was starving when I got here. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found Aunt Agnes. The trolley bumped and rumbled to a stop in front of the entrance to the Alamo Hotel. I'm getting off here. Me too. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Ruby asked, Please, can I see the book? Roy hesitated, then handed it to her upside down. Thief! A stampede of people chased a woman clutching a shiny piece of jewelry. She ran, her black skirt flying out behind her as she glanced back at her pursuers. Stop! That woman is a thief! The woman smacked into Ruby, sending the book flying. The trolley bell clanged and the streetcar rattled away. A man stopped next to Ruby, doubled over, and clutched his side. That's my wife's necklace. The woman disappeared around the corner and past the hotel entrance. Ruby shook Roy and pointed. He wasn't listening. He stared at the streetcar rails. The book lay on the tracks. The cover mangled and the pages severed from the spine. One whole section of the book was jammed into the frame of the trolley above the rear wheel. It disappeared around the same corner as the fleeing woman. My aunt's going to kill me. I promised, Roy repeated for emphasis. Promised I would take good care of it. It was almost new. So I guess I'll stop there if that's okay. So yeah. So well, thank you for being such nice listeners. But just briefly, so what the book title turned out to be a copy of Dracula, which when I do my research, I always try to see, well, what were the books that were published during those years, and it had actually come out like in 1897 in Britain, and then there's a whole deal with, it's kind of tied in, which is a little bit different from some of my other stories, but it was really fun to try to weave that strand of the book Dracula then in with this particular historical fiction story. But anyway, yeah.
Questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So when you're working with your research,
Yes.
I'm guessing the process is different for every
Yes.
book. But for this book,
Yes.
when was it story first and you brought the research in? I mean, obviously you had to start doing the Colorado Springs
Right.
research.
Right.
So did the research, like, so what's your process with that? And also, is there one particular, I'm sure there's more than one, but one particular fact that you came across that perhaps made it into the book that wasn't part of your original story? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. There were lots of facts that didn't make it in because you always have more research than what you can fit in the book. And
Right.
and one just to sidetrack a little, one thing that's really kind of touchy about writing historical fiction is, it's tempting. You have all this research and you want to get it out there on the page. Well, that doesn't work with a fiction book. You have to get, the story does come first. So my every single book I've written has had a different approach because I sometimes I do, the facts do inform the story, and sometimes, vice versa, that you have to say this fact doesn't fit because of the story. And I'm trying to think of one thing that, the Dracula strand was one, when I started out, I thought I'm never going to get this pulled together into one whole because, that's a toughie as far as, just down to one thing that popped into that. But I loved reading. I actually went back and read the original Dracula, which I'd never done, and so that was kind of fun. So it probably had to do with like Roy's dad maybe coming back. He came back and got a hold of Roy and took him home. So it was kind of this underlying theme and how frightened he was. And there was because I loved like in Colorado Springs, there's the Pinnacle Rock, that whole area, and I loved sort of finding out what it was like, and sometimes you have to move things around a little bit, and so I usually cover those in an author's note, like, so this really was closer, but I needed to put it closer because of the story, and I just can't think of just exactly one. So, but good question. You made me think. I just didn't think an answer. But
No, thank you. That was really interesting.
No.
The Dracula angle was super.
yeah, and it was like, how am I going to ever get this to come together? And so it and really make it fit the story. And so it kind of did. It kind of leaves you. There's a little question at the end as to what, because the kids were, scared to death. When you read that original Dracula, there's some lines in there about, when the characters bats are scratching at the window, and there's some kind of scary stuff. I doubt whether kids today would be interested in reading that, that version, but it was fun for me to research and then tie that in there. So it was good to. And there was a lot of interplay between Roy and Ruby about, I'm not afraid, and then they would show the opposite. So it was kind of a back and forth thing about being afraid and nightmares at night, and some of those things. But and that might have been a surprise because I don't think I really thought that out, ahead of time what that relationship would turn out to be. So,
Thank you.
well, thank you. So. No.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, well, if you think of something, I'll be here.
Great.
Oh, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah.
And I forgot to thank the Colorado Humanities for sponsoring this
Yes.
contest.
We love the Colorado Humanities.
Yeah.
The second author today is a finalist in the Young Adult Lit category. His name is Len Vlahos, and he wrote The Girl on the Ferris Wheel with Julie Halpern. Len is the author of The Scar Boys, a William C. Morris Award finalist and a #1 Indie Next Pick, and Scar Girl, the book's sequel, and he's also a musician, which I'm very jealous of. Julie Halpern is the award-winning author of 7 young adult novels, 1 adult novel, and 1 picture book for young readers. And she lives in Chicago, so this was a collaboration. I'll introduce Len. Come on up and share your story.
So, thank you. Before I talk about this book, I have to say, you just brought back a memory. I was working as the overnight on-air personality for a radio station in Atlantic City, New Jersey, in the mid and late 1980s, and so I'm alone there in the station, just me at night. I'm in this little room. It's easy listening. It's literally Muzak, and you would put these 3 reel to reel, so one song would trigger the next. So I would only do something every 15 minutes. So I would read, and I was reading Dracula, and I don't remember what point in the book is, but the light bulb in the room burned out, and I've never been so scared in my life. That book is absolutely terrifying. And I do think, I understand the language is probably a little arcane for kids today, but it builds tension. It is really a classic of the horror genre, and I hope kids do read it. And I was dying, when you said the D and the A, I was racking my brain, and I'm mad I didn't come up with Dracula. But anyway, thank you to the Bookies and Book Bar, and thank you to Colorado Humanities. I am thrilled, and on behalf of Julie, we're thrilled to be included with the finalists. It's such an honor. And thank you, Denise, for being here to introduce. It's lovely to see you again. Okay, so Girl on the Ferris Wheel is a story of high school sophomores Eliana and Dimitri. As we talked about, I co-wrote it with Julie, who's written books Get Well Soon and The F It List and a number of other really wonderful books. And the story alternates between Eliana and Dimitri chapters, and they're told in the first person. Eliana is a painfully shy girl from a Jewish family, and she's been battling depression through much of her teenage years, even missing a considerable amount of time in school to get treatment. Her internal monologue is funny and it's snarky. Dimitri, and I wrote the Dimitri chapter, she wrote the Eliana. Dimitri is outgoing, confident. He's from a very Greek family. His parents and his grandmother are all born in Greece, his grandmother Yaya. And he's also defined by music. He's a drummer in a popular local band called Unexpected Turbulence. I'm going to read a chapter from the middle of the book. Eliana and Dimitri start dating. This is a little bit of a setup, and he falls hard for her, and he starts to smother her. Ellie feels suffocated, but Dimitri it's his first love. He's just not capable of seeing it. The more she pushes him away, the closer he pushes them to get. So this chapter takes place as his family is getting ready to prepare for a big Christmas celebration. Should I wait? Somebody found, you guys must sell a really cool toy.
Well, I think I want one now.
Yeah, I kind of do too. Okay, so this is the chapter. The family's getting ready for a big Christmas celebration. Please, I say, not the asparagus. What? My mother answers. It's more of a complaint than a question. Everything my mother says is more of a complaint than a question. She's standing on the small stone ledge in front of the fireplace, using a pushpin to hang a bouquet of asparagus from a metal wire. It keep Callan Kanzori away. You want them in your house? She turns and winks at me, like, of course I want to keep the bad spirits away. How could I not want to keep the bad spirits away? Ma, I'm not sure there are any Callan Kanzori in America. I think they're only in Greece. No, she says, putting a second and third pushpin into the wood of the mantle. They smart. They find you, especially if you bad boy. I sigh at the battle already lost. Hey, it was worth a try. I suppose the tapestry of cultures from all over the world is part of what makes America great. But right now, the fireplace feels like a billboard screaming that my family is different. I'm already nervous enough about Ellie coming over Christmas Day, and the asparagus isn't helping. The civilization that gave us Aristotle and Pythagoras also gave us asparagus, a coincidentally weird hybrid of the words Aristotle and Pythagoras, as a guard against clawed-hooved elves. Really? Some days I wish I was Irish. I wanted to take Ellie out for a movie in Chinese food. She told me this was called a Jewish Christmas, which I thought was funny and sounded like a nice way to spend the day. But my father wouldn't hear of me not being home. You invite the Jew girl. Ah, my mother interrupted. Sorry, you invite the Jewish girl here. Can we please start calling her Eliana, I ask? Okay, you invite Eliana here. She should meet your family. My mother's invitation sounded final enough that I didn't argue. Ellie's already met my parents and Yaya enough times to get a sense of who we are, but Christmas Day ratchets it up to a whole new level. Uncle Gus and Aunt V will be here with my cousins George and Aspasia. not first cousins, but some number cousins, some number of times removed, whose identity is almost completely defined by our ancestral culture, which means George is going to try and flirt with Eliana, and Aspasia is going to spend the day in the kitchen with the older women. Aunt Stella, my mother's younger sister, also known by me and Nikki as the cheek pincher, is coming with her new and third husband, Spiro. And, of course, Aunt Maxine will be here. Maxine is older than dirt and has this weird disease that makes one of her eyeballs bulge out of her head. Nikki refers to her as Mad Eye Maxine. She wears big old lady sunglasses to cover it, which somehow makes it worse. You can still see the wonky eye through the tinted lenses, and indoors at night, it's downright creepy. It's not only the cast of my big fat Greek wedding that has me feeling anxious. We go the whole 9 yards. The lamb on the spit in the backyard, the singing of traditional Greek carols, the decorating of boats. And I'm just positive it's going to make Ellie question our whole relationship. The only saving grace is that I've got a secret weapon to protect against all this Greekishness Ellie is going to be clobbered with. I am 1,000% sure I have completely nailed it with my Christmas present for her. Well, Christmas presents. First, Janina helped me pick out this very classy necklace. It's a single polished pearl, Ellie's birthstone, on a silver chain. I think it's pretty, and Janina assures me Ellie is going to love it. My initial plan was to get a D and E tattoo, someplace my parents wouldn't be able to see, and to surprise Ellie in private, but Janina suggested that wasn't the best idea. I think her exact words are, "What are you, stupid?" When you're in love, you do stupid things, I guess. I knew she was right as soon as she said it. The best present, the one that will show Ellie how much I really do treasure her, is that I paid Joe Loskowitz $50 to switch lockers with me. Starting January 3rd, our first day back from Christmas break, I'll be Ellie's locker neighbor. Now, she and I can see each other between every single period. She is going to flip. My mother finishes with the asparagus and starts on the thistle. I give up and go to the kitchen. Yaya is sitting at the table. Her two hands, which are wrapped around a mug of thick black coffee, are shaking a little. She looks drawn out, thinner, like maybe she's fading away. But then she sees me and lights up, and she's Yaya again. "Dimimu, come, sit." I do. "I hear you talking to your mother." "I know, Yaya. It's just," Yaya puts a hand up, and I stop. "Dimi, this is who you are, who we are. We hold on to this to remember where we're from, nay?" I nod. "You honored your ancestor by remembering. You honored me. This girl, she love you? Then she love all of you." I gloss over the fact that I still haven't grown stones to tell Ellie I love her. And since I'm too chicken to do that, I do the next best thing. "I love you, Yaya." I stand up and kiss my grandmother on the forehead. "Of course you do, Dimmy," she says, patting my wrist. "There is a lot to love." And then she breaks out laughing, and I can't help but join her. Thank you. And yes, I'm Greek, by the way. So, if that wasn't obvious. So,
Question. I have one.
yeah.
So it sounds like you alternated chapters with your co-writer, but
Yes.
what was the plotting process like? How did you guys collaborate on that?
So it's a great question, and it's sort of like the eternal writer question, right? Are you a plotter or a pantser? And I will tell you, I am a recovering pantser, right? In my first couple of books, it was seat of my pants, and the last couple have been plotted. Collaborating, we didn't really know, so we pantsed it. We started with the idea that it was a boy-girl breakup book, and the boy was going to be devastated. That's what we started with. So Julie wrote her first Eliana chapter and sent it to me, and I kind of had in my head what I knew. I'd never written a Greek character before. I grew up in my parents were born here, so I'm second generation. But I had lots of relatives who sort of were very much like Dimitri's family, and I wanted to write about that, and I wanted to go back to writing about music, so I made him a drummer. So these are the things I had in my head, and Julie had some things in her head, so we just started trading chapters, and it just evolved. So the plot really happened organically.
Did you go like that the whole way, or did at some point you come back together and talk about like, oh, I think it's going this direction, so let's...
We did chat from time to time about whether or not, about the direction it was going, but it was more organic than not. Julie and I have still to this day never met. Her publisher put us together. We met via phone first, and then started writing. Actually, I was telling Denise this. We met via phone and started writing, and it was so bad. It was really just terrible. And I didn't know, and I don't think Julie knew why. And what really turned out to be is we started writing too quickly. We did need to get to know each other a little bit. And it turned out we're similar age. We sort of the 80s was our decade. We liked the same kind of music and movies and books, and so we like more like the punk new wave stuff. Like that was where we were, and once we got to know each other a bit, it became a lot easier to write. It was my first collaboration. I hope it's not my last. It was, and we had fun doing it. I'm looking forward to someday meeting her. Her husband is also a Caldecott award-winning children's book author, Matt Cordell. Wolf in the Snow, is that what it is?
Wolf in the Snow, I know that's a great book.
Is that what it's called? I'm looking at Kristen.
And illustrator.
And he writes and illustrates, yeah. So, yes, so, but the most fun thing for me was, and my sister read this, and she's read all my books, and this was her favorite, and I think it was because of all the Greek stuff, and our Yaya, and people who have read this, the feedback I've got, Yaya is everyone's favorite character, and she was Yaya was one of my favorite people in the world. This is not quite my grandmother, but she definitely shows up in there, so.
I have a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
because you talked about getting to know each other and that helped with the writing. And was that partly because you infused yourselves in the books, or thought of the other person or the other character in terms of the author? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. I think first of all, I've never written a book or a character, and I've written some I wrote an anthropomorphized brain tumor for one of my books, right? And every character an author writes, you're infusing something of you somewhere in that character, consciously or not. So yes, so it helped to know, when I was reading Eliana chapters, to know a little bit about Julie, to connect some of those dots. I presume it helped her in the same way to know a little bit about me, to connect some of the dots with Dimitri. And Dimitri's is not autobiographical. I was much less confident, I think, than Dimitri when I was that age, and I was a guitar player, not a drummer. All guitar players want to be drummers. But it's if Mary and I were to sit down and write a book together, we know nothing about each other. We would need to take a little time and figure out, who we were, I think, to start that process.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about anthropomorphized brain tumors?
Another follow-up. So what was the biggest challenge then of collaborating versus, doing a project on your own, or like so?
So it's definitely the art of
That's just the
it's
fascinating part.
it's the art of compromise, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I get a chapter, I write a chapter. You can't help but then have expectations about where it's going to go and what direction it's going to come back.
Right.
And when it doesn't come back that direction, you have to adjust your expectations. And it's also about trust, right? You've got to put your faith and your trust in this other person, and in their writing ability and in their ability to draw a character and a character arc. Eliana's character arc, they both have well-defined character arcs in this book. I think Eliana's is even more clearly defined than Dimitri's, right? She's the. I think it's very much a co-equal, but maybe she's 1A and he's 1B in terms of the actual structure of the plot and the story, because her battles with depression are really, it's the centerpiece of what makes him act a certain way and what makes her act a certain way. And Julie did, I thought, a masterful job, by the way, in capturing that piece of it. And she's talked about it openly, that she has battled depression, and she was writing from a place of intimacy, and so.
But you clearly liked it, because you said you'd welcome an opportunity to collaborate again.
I would collaborate with Julie or with somebody else, because it was a fun process. Writing is, I always say, publishing is a very collaborative process. Getting a book published it takes whether you're self-publishing or whether you're traditionally published, there is a team of people involved in bringing a book to the market. Writing is an incredibly solitary process. And I have never been someone, I've been in writers groups before, and I usually bring short fiction. Or I finish a manuscript and I bring the finished manuscript and read pieces. Once I start writing a manuscript, even Kristen, my wife, I don't want anybody looking at any of it, because what's going to happen is I'm going to get voices in my head, and I've already got too many of those, right? So I for sure don't want. So collaborating was a new thing for me, because now we're sharing work as we go, and I found it to be really fun. Having played in bands for years as a kid, that's a very collaborative process too, and it felt kind of like that. We were sort of a band.
What a great analogy.
So I hadn't thought of it till you asked that question, so thank you.
You just improvised.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm ready to read both of them right now.
You're like, I'm like, what? What's going to happen? And she's going to have her adventures. Anyway, great. Thank you. And unfortunately, the other finalists in these two categories weren't able to come, so that's too bad. But their books are available if anyone's interested in getting them. Just want to reiterate a thank you to Book Bar, Buggies, for hosting our reading series, and obviously the Colorado Book Awards, the entrants, the judges, the selectors, the volunteers, all the people who make things like this possible, all the Colorado Book Award staff, and thanking all of you who are sitting here supporting writers and writing and reading. And we can't forget June 25th at the Ellie Calkins Opera House Studio Loft at 4:30. Colorado Book Award finalist celebration and the winner announcements. And that will also include brief readings by the winners and a reception. So you can get on the Colorado Humanities Book website to register and join them and the writers. So thank you. Thanks for coming.